The moment Valira was born, High Matron Zayla knew something was wrong. The attending geneticist's sharp intake of breath was enough. The woman's grimace, as she examined the newborn, confirmed it. In a society where genetic perfection was not just preferred, but mandated. Valira's round pupils, circular instead of the perfect Ascari elliptical shape, marked her as flawed from her first breath. "A genetic anomaly, High Matron," the geneticist had whispered, refusing to meet Zayla's eyes. "The ocular formation is incorrect." Zayla, commander of the Fourth Fleet and one of the 7 High Matrons who governed the planet Avera, had stared at her daughter with a clinical detachment that would define their relationship for the next 20 years. "Log it," she had ordered. "Mark the birth record as compromised. Keep her isolated from the other newborns." And so began Valira's life, born wrong. A genetic aberration in a world where such deviations were considered dangerous to the purity of the Ascari bloodline. Now, 20 years later, Valira stood before the monthly genetic compliance scanner, her face an impassive mask as the machine's cold blue light washed over her features. The technician, a young Ascari with perfect elliptical pupils and the typical ash-blue skin of the ruling caste, refused to look directly at her, as most did. To acknowledge Valira was to acknowledge imperfection, and imperfection was a contagion in Ascari society. "Spread your fingers for the neural mapping," the technician instructed, her voice flat and mechanical. Valira complied, placing her hand on the scanner. She had undergone this humiliation every month since her 15th birthday, a special courtesy extended to genetic anomalies. Most Ascari were only tested annually. "The readings are—" The technician frowned, tapping the screen. "This can't be right." Valira's heart rate increased. Any deviation from routine was dangerous for someone already marked as defective. "What is it?" Valira asked, her voice deliberately calm, controlled, the way she had trained herself to speak to mask her emotions. Emotions were dangerous on Avera. They were the primitive remnants of less evolved species. The Ascari had engineered most emotional responses out of their genetics centuries ago. The technician's eyes widened as she studied the readout. "The neural pattern. I've never seen anything like it." She reached for the emergency communication panel. "I need to contact the Genetic Compliance Division." Before Valira could react, the doors to the scanning chamber hissed open. 4 Ascari elite guards entered, their faces hidden behind reflective masks, their bodies encased in the midnight blue armor of the Genetic Purification Unit. Behind them walked General Nizra, the most feared enforcer of genetic purity on Avera. Her elliptical pupils were unnaturally perfect, even by Ascari standards, and her ash-blue skin bore the ritual scarification of the truly devoted. Rumor had it that Nizra had voluntarily undergone genetic resequencing 7 times to purge any remaining impurities from her lineage. "Valira, daughter of High Matron Zayla." Nizra's voice was like steel scraping against glass. "Your neural scan has triggered a Class 1 genetic divergence alert." Valira kept her expression neutral, though her mind raced. Class 1 was the highest level, reserved for threats to the entire genetic pool. "There must be a mistake," Valira said, even as she knew arguing was pointless. The machines didn't make mistakes. Only genetics did. People like her were the mistakes. Nizra's thin lips twisted into what might have been a smile on any other face. "No mistake. Your neural pathways show a 98.7% compatibility match with Earth DNA." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Earth, the exiled planet, cast out from the Galactic Council centuries ago for their refusal to submit to genetic standardization. Humans were considered mentally contaminated, a species that had rejected the path of genetic perfection in favor of emotional chaos and unpredictable biological variation. "That's impossible," Valira whispered. "I've never even seen a human." "And yet, Your brain is wired like theirs. Nizra motioned to the guards. By order of the Genetic Council, you are to be immediately quarantined and prepared for deep neural examination. Valera knew what that meant. Deep neural examination was a euphemism for dissection. They wanted to understand why her brain matched human patterns, and they didn't need her alive to find out. The guards advanced, stun batons activated. Valera backed against the wall, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Her unusual eyes darted around the room, taking in details most Ascari would miss. The slight hesitation in the youngest guard's step, the emergency ventilation shaft behind the scanner, the way Nizra's hand rested too casually on her sidearm. "Please," Valera said, knowing it was useless. Ascari didn't respond to please. Emotion was weakness. And then, something unexpected happened. The youngest guard suddenly turned and fired her stun baton at the other 3 guards. In the moment of confusion, she grabbed Valera's arm. "Run," the guard whispered. "The Forbidden Zone. Southwest Quadrant. Now!" Valera didn't hesitate. As Nizra shouted commands and alarms blared, she bolted through the momentarily open door. Behind her, she heard the young guard cry out in pain, but there was no time to look back. The Forbidden Zone was a radiation-scarred wasteland from the last Great War, a place the Ascari avoided because its unpredictable energy fields interfered with their genetic purity monitoring systems. It was also, as Valera would soon discover, where fate had other plans for her. As she ran through the dense forest that bordered the city's edge, the sky above erupted in a brilliant flash of light. Something large and metallic tore through the atmosphere, trailing fire and smoke, its trajectory taking it directly into the heart of the Forbidden Zone. Valera paused, watching as the object, clearly some sort of spacecraft, crashed with a thunderous impact that shook the ground beneath her feet. In any other circumstance, she would have kept running. But something about the ship's design triggered a strange recognition in her mind. It wasn't Ascari. It wasn't even from any of the allied species she'd seen in the limited educational materials she'd been allowed to access. It was human. And despite everything she'd been taught about the dangers of Earth and its unpredictable inhabitants, Valera found herself running toward the crash site rather than away from it. The ship was smaller than she'd expected, a shuttle rather than a full transport vessel. Smoke poured from a gash in its side, and scattered debris marked its violent path through the forest. Valera approached cautiously, her Ascari combat training taking over as she scanned for threats. The hatch of the shuttle burst open with a hiss of hydraulics, and a figure stumbled out, coughing and waving away smoke. Valera froze, staring at the first human she had ever seen. He was tall, taller than most Ascari, with skin a color she'd never encountered before, somewhere between the tan hide of desert animals and the copper ore from the northern mountains. His eyes were startling, round pupils like hers, but set in irises of deep green rather than the uniform silver of Ascari eyes. His hair was dark and cropped short, and he wore a uniform of some kind, though not military from what she could tell. Most disturbing of all, his face was extraordinarily expressive, shifting between pain, confusion, and relief in rapid succession, displaying more emotion in seconds than an Ascari would typically show in months. Valera's hand moved to the ceremonial dagger at her hip, the only weapon she'd had time to grab during her escape. The human hadn't noticed her yet, too busy examining a wound on his arm and muttering words in a language her translator implant couldn't quite process. She should kill him immediately. That's what all her training demanded. Humans were mentally contaminated, dangerously emotional, unpredictable, a threat to genetic purity. The fact that her brain somehow resonated with their patterns made this human doubly dangerous to her. Valera stepped forward, dagger raised, and froze as the human finally noticed her. Instead of showing fear or reaching for a weapon, he simply stared, his expressive face registering surprise and then something she couldn't identify. He spoke, and this time her translator caught the words. "Well, you're definitely not the rescue party I was hoping for." Valera tightened her grip on the dagger. "Don't move, human." He raised his hand slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured arm. "No moving. Got it. I'm Eli Mason. And you are—" "Silence!" Valera snapped, unnerved by his casual demeanor. Humans were supposed to be dangerous, not conversational. Eli tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You have round pupils," he observed. "Like mine. But the rest of you is very different from humans. Are you a genetic hybrid, or is that a natural variation in your species?" Valera flinched at the direct reference to her deformity. "I said be silent!" Instead of obeying, the human, Eli, smiled slightly. "You know, it's interesting that the first thing you did was tell me not to move, but you seem more uncomfortable with me talking. Is verbal communication taboo in your culture? Or is it something about me specifically that bothers you?" Valera stepped forward and pressed the tip of her dagger against his throat. "One more word and I'll end you." Eli remained still, but his eyes, those unsettlingly expressive eyes, seemed to be analyzing her, seeing through her in a way no one ever had before. After a long moment of silence, he asked quietly, "How does it feel when your own mother calls you a system error?" Valera's hand trembled, the dagger pressing just hard enough to draw a tiny bead of red blood from his skin. "How could you possibly know about that?" "I didn't," Eli said gently. "But I recognize trauma when I see it, and whatever society you come from, they've hurt you deeply for being different. I'm guessing those round pupils of yours aren't the norm for your species." Valera stepped back, momentarily shocked by his perception. Before she could respond, the distant sound of Ascari hover transports reached her ears. The genetic purification unit was closing in. "They're coming for me," she said, almost to herself. "And I'm guessing they're not throwing you a surprise party," Eli replied, glancing toward the sound. "Look, I don't know what's happening here, but I'm pretty good at hiding from people who want to kill me. It's practically part of my job description. Maybe we could help each other." Valera hesitated. Everything she had ever been taught told her to kill this human and run. But everything she had ever been taught had also told her she was defective, wrong, a genetic mistake. And now she knew her brain was somehow compatible with his species, a species the Ascari had demonized for centuries. "Why should I trust you?" she demanded. Eli shrugged, wincing again at his injury. "You shouldn't, rationally speaking. But those ships are getting closer, and I'm betting neither of us wants to be here when they arrive. So how about a temporary alliance of convenience? You help me find somewhere to hide and treat this arm, and I'll try to be useful somehow." The hover transports were getting louder. Valera made her decision. "This way," she said, turning toward the densest part of the forest. "And if you betray me, human, I will make your death last for days." Eli followed her, a strange half-smile on his face. "You know, where I come from, we usually just start with coffee." As they disappeared into the undergrowth, the first Ascari scout ships appeared overhead, searchlights cutting through the forest canopy, hunting for the genetic anomaly who had dared to escape her fate, unaware that she had just made contact with the very species she had been condemned for resembling. And somewhere, in the cold, sterile chambers of the Genetic Council, High Matron Zayla received the report of her daughter's escape with an expression that, for just a moment, might have been mistaken for relief. Part 2. Psychologist meets outcast. 1 listens. 1 learns. The forest grew denser as they moved deeper into the forbidden zone. Vegetation here was different, more vibrant, less controlled than the carefully engineered botanical gardens of the Ascari cities. plants of impossible colors twisted around trees that stood taller than any building Valira had ever seen. The air hummed with energy from the ancient radiation, creating auroras that danced between the branches overhead. "What is this place?" Eli asked, his voice hushed with wonder rather than fear. "The Forbidden Zone," Valira replied curtly, scanning their surroundings for pursuit. "A battlefield from the last Great War. The radiation altered the ecosystem. The Ascari avoid it because it interferes with their genetic monitoring systems." "And the Ascari are your people?" Valira's jaw tightened. "They are not my people. Not anymore." They continued in silence until they reached a small clearing where a massive fallen tree created a natural shelter. Valira motioned for Eli to get inside the hollow trunk, then followed, positioning herself near the opening where she could watch for pursuers. Eli settled against the inner wall of the trunk, examining his injured arm in the dim light, filtering through cracks in the bark. The wound was a deep gash running from elbow to wrist. "I don't suppose you have any medical supplies?" he asked. Without a word, Valira reached into a hidden pocket in her uniform and extracted a small silver case. She tossed it to him. "Basic emergency kit," she explained. "Disinfectant, synthetic skin sealant, pain suppressors." Eli opened the case and examined the unfamiliar items. "Thanks. Mind showing me how these work? Human medicine might be a bit different." Valira hesitated, then moved closer. She took the items from him and began treating his wound with efficient, practiced movements. "You have medical training," Eli observed. "All Ascari do," she replied, "even defective ones." As she worked, Eli studied her. "So, those round pupils of yours? That's considered a defect." Valira's hands paused momentarily before continuing. "The Ascari prize genetic purity above all else. Elliptical pupils are the standard. I was born wrong." "Born different," Eli corrected gently. "Not wrong." Valira finished applying the synthetic skin sealant and moved back to her position at the trunk's opening. "Semantics don't change reality. In Ascari society, different is wrong." "And what happened today? Why were they suddenly hunting you more actively?" Valira's silver eyes, round-pupiled and sharp, fixed on him. "They discovered that my neural patterns match those of humans. Like you. A 98.7% compatibility match." Eli's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's unexpected. I'm guessing humans aren't popular around here?" "Humans were expelled from the Galactic Council centuries ago for refusing genetic standardization. Your species is considered mentally contaminated, slaves to emotion and biological variation." Valira's voice held the flat, recitative quality of someone repeating lessons learned by rote. "Ah," Eli nodded. "So when they discovered your brain is wired like ours?" "They ordered me taken for neural examination." "Which means?" "Dissection." Eli winced. "Charming folk, these Ascari." He shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. "You mentioned a High Matron Zayla earlier. Is she the leader?" "One of 7 who rule Ivera. She's also my mother." "And she was willing to let them dissect you?" Eli's voice was carefully neutral, but Valira could hear something underneath, an emotion her limited experience couldn't identify. "High Matron Zayla has always prioritized genetic purity over maternal bonds. When I was born defective, she personally ordered my isolation from other children. She refers to me as a system error in official documentation." Eli was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "How did that make you feel?" The question struck Valira like a physical blow. No one had ever asked about her feelings. Feelings were irrelevant in Ascari society, primitive responses to be engineered away. "Feel?" she repeated, the word awkward on her tongue. "Yes. When your mother rejected you for being different, when she called you a system error, what emotions did that create in you?" Valira turned away, staring out into the forest. Ascari don't discuss emotions. They're considered primitive weaknesses. But you have them, Eli said. It wasn't a question. A further defect in my makeup, apparently, Valira replied bitterly. No. Eli shook his head. If your neural patterns match human ones, then emotion isn't a defect. It's a fundamental part of how your brain processes information. Asking you to suppress emotion would be like asking you not to use your frontal lobe. Valira remained silent, unwilling to engage with concepts that challenged everything she had been taught. I should tell you, Eli continued after a moment. I'm a psychological warfare officer. My job is understanding how different minds process trauma, fear, and social conditioning, and how to use that understanding tactically. Valira's hand moved to her dagger. You're a mind manipulator. Eli laughed softly. Nothing so dramatic. I'm what my people call a psychologist, someone who studies how minds work. The military just happens to employ me to understand how that knowledge applies in conflict situations. Why are you telling me this? Valira demanded, suspicious. Professional habit, Eli shrugged. I believe in informed consent. If we're going to talk, you should know my background. We're not going to talk, Valira said firmly. Once it's safe, we go our separate ways. Fair enough, Eli agreed easily. But, until then, maybe you could tell me more about Ascari society? Understanding your cultural context might help me avoid getting us both killed. Despite her reservations, Valira found herself explaining the fundamentals of Ascari civilization, their rigid matriarchal hierarchy, their obsession with genetic purity, the categorization of citizens based on genetic conformity scores. She described the monthly testing, the isolation of deviants, and the ruthless efficiency with which the genetic purification unit eliminated threats to the gene pool. Eli listened without interruption, his expressive face registering reactions that Valira couldn't fully interpret. When she finished, he remained thoughtful for several minutes. Your society has engineered itself into an evolutionary dead end, he finally said. What do you mean? Genetic diversity is essential for species survival, Eli explained. By eliminating imperfections, the Ascari are narrowing their genetic pool to the point of vulnerability. One novel virus, one environmental change, and your entire species could be wiped out because you've eliminated the very variations that might have provided resistance. Valira had never considered this perspective. The Council teaches that purity equals strength. The Council is wrong, Eli stated flatly. From a biological standpoint, they're dangerously wrong. Homogeneity is vulnerability, not strength. Before Valira could respond, a distant sound caught her attention, the distinctive hum of Ascari sensor drones. They're sweeping the area, she whispered. We need to move. They slipped out of the hollow tree and deeper into the forest. As they moved, Eli continued their conversation in hushed tones. Your neural compatibility with humans is fascinating, he said. It suggests either a common evolutionary ancestor or parallel development under similar conditions. Or a genetic anomaly, Valira countered. Maybe, Eli conceded. But what if it's not? What if your brain structure represents a natural variation within Ascari genetics? One that's been suppressed through selective breeding and genetic engineering. The thought was unsettling. Why would they do that? Control, Eli suggested. Emotional complexity makes people harder to predict, harder to control. A society obsessed with order might see that as threatening. They paused at the edge of a small stream, listening for pursuers. The forest had grown eerily quiet. Your emotional responses, Eli continued. How do you handle them? Valira stiffened. I suppress them, as all Ascari are taught. But you feel them first, Eli pressed. You experience anger, fear, curiosity. I've seen them cross your face, however briefly. Another failure of control, Valira admitted reluctantly. Eli shook his head. Not failure. Humanity. Or perhaps I should say, sentience. Emotion is not separate from reason. It's an integral part of the decision-making process. Without emotional context, reason becomes unmoored, detached from values. Values are subjective, Valira recited. Genetic purity is objective. Is it? Eli challenged. Who defined purity? Who decided elliptical pupils were superior to round ones? These aren't objective standards. They're cultural constructs masquerading as biological imperatives. Before Valira could respond, the foliage behind them exploded in a burst of energy fire. 3 Askari trackers emerged, weapons raised. Genetic deviation identified, one called out. Surrender for processing. Valira pushed Eli behind her and drew her dagger. Run, I'll hold them off. Instead of running, Eli stepped beside her. They outnumber us and have ranged weapons. Fighting isn't the optimal strategy. Then what is? Valira demanded. Eli's eyes darted around, assessing their surroundings. The stream. Can these Askari swim? No, Valira replied. Aquatic environments are considered genetically contaminating. A slow smile spread across Eli's face. Fascinating. Follow my lead, but be ready to dive into the water on my signal. To Valira's astonishment, Eli stepped forward, hands raised, and began speaking directly to the trackers. Greetings, genetically superior beings, he called out in a formal, almost ritualistic tone. I am requesting asylum under Section 7 of the Galactic Council's Refugee Protocol. The trackers hesitated, clearly confused by the unfamiliar approach. Eli continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic rhythm. As you can see, I am clearly not Askari. My presence here is the result of a navigation error and subsequent crash. According to interstellar law, you are obligated to contact the Galactic Council's Refugee Division before taking any action against me. The lead tracker lowered her weapon slightly. The human is attempting to confuse us with irrelevant protocols. Not irrelevant, Eli countered smoothly. The Askari pride themselves on their logical adherence to law, do they not? To ignore interstellar refugee protocols would be illogical, emotionally driven, even. The accusation of emotional behavior visibly disturbed the trackers. As they conferred among themselves, Eli whispered to Valira, Get ready. For what? She whispered back. Trust me, he murmured, then, louder, to the trackers. Of course, if you're experiencing emotional responses that prevent you from following protocol, perhaps you should report to genetic compliance for evaluation. I understand round pupils are a particular concern. Now! He suddenly shouted, grabbing Valira's arm and plunging into the stream. The trackers fired, but their shots went wide as Eli and Valira disappeared beneath the surface. The current was stronger than it appeared, quickly carrying them downstream and away from their pursuers. When they finally emerged, gasping for air, they had traveled nearly a kilometer from the trackers. Eli helped Valira onto the bank, both of them soaked and shivering. How did you know that would work? Valira demanded between breaths. Eli grinned, water dripping from his hair. Basic psychological leverage. Your society has conditioned its members to fear emotional reactions and genetic contamination. I just used that conditioning against them. They were so concerned about appearing emotional that they hesitated. And I guess they wouldn't follow us into water they believe is contaminating. Valira stared at him, seeing the human in a new light. You manipulated their fears. I redirected their conditioning, Eli corrected. It's a standard psychological warfare technique, using an opponent's beliefs against them. They found shelter in a cave set into a hillside, far enough from the stream to avoid immediate detection. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and they huddled near a small heat source from Eli's emergency kit. You should sleep, Eli suggested. I'll keep watch. Valira shook her head. Askari require less rest than humans. I'll watch. At least close your eyes for a while, Eli insisted. Mental fatigue impairs judgment even when physical fatigue hasn't set in. Reluctantly, Valira leaned back against the cave wall, though she kept her dagger ready in her hand. As her eyes began to close, Eli spoke again. "I've been thinking about your neural compatibility with humans," he said quietly. "I'd like to try something tomorrow, if you're willing." "What?" Valera asked, suspicious but curious. "A series of cognitive exercises. If your brain is wired like ours, you might have capabilities the Ascari have trained you to suppress. Emotional intelligence, intuitive reasoning, creative problem-solving. To what end?" Eli's expression grew serious. "Survival, primarily. But beyond that, liberation. The chance to discover who you are when you're not defined by their standards of genetic correctness." Valera was silent for a long moment. "Why would you help me?" "Professional curiosity. Partly," Eli admitted. "I've never encountered an alien species with human-compatible neural patterns. But mostly," he hesitated, "mostly because I recognize what it's like to be told you're broken when you're simply different." Something in his tone made Valera look at him more closely. "You were considered defective among your people." A shadow crossed Eli's face. "Not genetically, but yes, in a way. I process information differently than most humans. My brain sees patterns others miss, makes connections they don't follow. As a child, they called it a disorder. As an adult, the military found it useful and called it a gift." He smiled faintly. "Neither label was quite right. I'm just differently wired." For the first time since their meeting, Valera felt something unexpected. A connection, a recognition of shared experience across the vast gulf of their different species. "Sleep," Eli said gently. "Tomorrow we can begin discovering just how wrong they were about both of us." As Valera drifted into an uneasy sleep, her last conscious thought was a question that would have been heretical in Ascari society. What if being born wrong meant she was actually born right for a different purpose, one the genetic council couldn't begin to comprehend? And deep in the Forbidden Forest, as General Nizra directed her forces in an ever-widening search pattern, her perfect elliptical pupils narrowed with determination. The genetic anomaly would not escape. Too much depended on maintaining the purity of the Ascari gene pool. Too much depended on ensuring no one ever discovered the truth about Nizra herself. That beneath her fanatical devotion to genetic perfection lay the desperate secret of a woman who had once been considered as flawed as Valira, and who had sacrificed everything to remake herself in the image of Ascari ideal. Part 3. She was not broken. She was rewired. Dawn broke over the Forbidden Zone, painting the mutated forest in shades of purple and gold. Valira woke instantly, as she had been trained to do, her hand already tightening around her dagger. It took her a moment to register that Eli was no longer in the cave. She sprang to her feet, a complex mixture of emotions flooding her system: concern, betrayal, fear. Had he abandoned her? Been captured? Her question was answered a moment later, when Eli appeared at the cave entrance, carrying what appeared to be local fruit. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "Hope you don't mind, but I scouted the immediate area and found breakfast. These look similar to fruits I've seen on other worlds, though I'm not sure if they're safe for your physiology." Valera stared at him, trying to process his casual behavior. "You left without waking me." "You needed the rest," Eli replied, setting down the fruit and taking a seat opposite her. "And I needed to get a better understanding of our surroundings." "I could have helped with that." "You can help with the next task," Eli said, reaching into his pack and removing a small device. "This is a neural scanner, basic equipment for my work. If you're willing, I'd like to get a more detailed reading of your brain patterns." Valera eyed the device suspiciously. "Why?" "Two reasons," Eli explained. "First, to better understand your neural compatibility with humans. which might help us figure out why the Ascari are so afraid of it. Second, to identify any latent capabilities you might have that Ascari conditioning has suppressed. Capabilities. Eli nodded. Based on our interactions so far, I suspect you have significant emotional intelligence and intuitive processing abilities that have been systematically trained out of you. If we can access those abilities, they might give us an advantage against your pursuers. Valera hesitated, then nodded once. Proceed. Eli moved closer and held the device near her temple. This won't hurt. Just try to relax and think neutral thoughts. The scanner hummed softly as it worked. Eli watched its display with increasing interest, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or confirmation. Remarkable, he murmured after several minutes. Your neural architecture is indeed structured like a human brain, but with several unique adaptations. Your emotional processing centers are highly developed, more so than average for humans, but show signs of suppression through what looks like systematic conditioning. Meaning what exactly? Valera asked. Eli lowered the scanner. Meaning, you were born with an extraordinary capacity for emotional intelligence and intuitive reasoning. But your society has trained you to ignore these capabilities, treating them as defects rather than strengths. He set the scanner aside and leaned forward, his expression intense. Valera, I believe your round pupils are just a visible marker of a more fundamental genetic variation, one that gives you a type of intelligence the Ascari have been trying to engineer out of their population. Valera frowned. Why would they do that? Because emotional intelligence makes you harder to control, Eli said simply. People who can intuitively understand others' motivations, who can navigate complex social dynamics through emotion rather than rigid protocol. Such people are inherently resistant to authoritarian systems. He paused, letting the implications sink in. I suspect your neural patterns aren't a defect at all. They're an evolutionary adaptation that threatens the Ascari power structure. Valera stood abruptly and paced the small cave. Even if what you say is true, how does this help us now? The entire genetic purification unit is hunting us. It helps because we can begin to unlock those suppressed abilities, Eli replied. With the right techniques, we can essentially reprogram your responses, not to erase your emotions, as the Ascari have tried to do, but to harness them as the powerful tools they are. Valera stopped pacing and faced him. How? We start with basic mindfulness exercises, Eli said, rising to stand across from her. I want you to close your eyes and focus on your breathing. This is not the time for meditation, Valera protested. It's exactly the time, Eli countered. Trust me on this. Close your eyes. Reluctantly, Valera complied. Now, Eli continued, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality. I want you to pay attention to the physical sensations in your body, the temperature of the air on your skin, the weight of your feet on the ground, the movement of your chest as you breathe. As Valera focused on these sensations, Eli continued speaking, guiding her attention to different aspects of her physical experience. Now, I want you to notice any emotions present without judging them. Just observe what you're feeling. Valera's brow furrowed. I feel concern, urgency, doubt. Good, Eli encouraged. Don't try to change these feelings or suppress them. Just acknowledge them as information your body is providing. They continued with similar exercises for nearly an hour. Eli taught Valera to identify emotional states by their physical signatures. The tightness in the chest that signaled fear, the warmth that indicated connection, the lightness that accompanied relief. What you're feeling isn't weakness, he explained as they took a break. It's a sophisticated biological information system. Emotions evolved as rapid response mechanisms to complex situations. They're a form of intelligence, one that operates faster than conscious reasoning in many scenarios. Valera considered this. The Ascari teach that emotions are primitive responses that should be replaced with logical analysis. That's a false dichotomy, Eli replied. Emotions don't replace logic. They complement it. They provide context and values that give logical reasoning its direction and purpose. Their lesson was interrupted by a distant rumbling. They moved to the cave entrance and saw smoke rising from the forest to the east. "They're burning sections of the forest," Valira said grimly. "Standard containment protocol for difficult captures." Eli's expression hardened. "We need to move. But first," he turned to face her directly, "I want to try one more exercise, something more advanced." "There's no time," Valera objected. "Make time," Eli insisted. "This could save our lives." He placed his hands on her shoulders, the direct physical contact making Valira flinch slightly. "I want you to recall a moment when you felt most intensely, a time when emotion was so strong you couldn't suppress it." Valira closed her eyes, reluctantly searching her memories. "When I was 16, she finally said, I discovered an archive record that showed my mother had considered terminating my gestation when the genetic scan revealed my defect. She was overruled by the council, who wanted to study the anomaly. When I confronted her, she said she had only been calculating optimal resource allocation." Eli's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders. "And how did that make you feel?" "Rage," Valera whispered. "Pure rage. I broke a ceremonial vase in her chamber, the only time I ever lost control." "And what happened after?" "I was sedated and placed in isolation for a month. Additional emotional suppression conditioning was added to my education program." Eli nodded. "I want you to access that rage again, not to be consumed by it, but to channel it. Feel it in your body. Where does it sit?" Valera's hand moved to her chest. "Here, like fire." "Good. Now imagine that fire flowing through your limbs, becoming energy, becoming focus. Not mindless anger, but directed power." To Valera's surprise, the exercise worked. The rage she had suppressed for years transformed into a kind of clarity, a heightened awareness that made her senses sharper, her mind quicker. "This is how humans operate?" she asked, amazed at the sensation. "The ones who've learned to integrate their emotional and rational faculties." "Yes," Eli confirmed. "Now, let's apply it. We need to evade capture, which means predicting how your pursuers think. Put yourself in General Nizra's mind. What's her next move?" Valera closed her eyes, drawing on her new emotional awareness to imagine Nizra's perspective. "She's methodical. She'll establish a perimeter and work inward. But she's also afraid." "Afraid of what?" Eli prompted. "Of failure. Of contamination." Valira's eyes snapped open. "Of me. I represent everything she fears: genetic deviation, emotional capacity, the potential disruption of the system that gives her power. And how will that fear influence her tactics? She'll become more extreme, more willing to accept collateral damage." Valira looked toward the smoke rising from the forest. "She's not just trying to capture me anymore. She's trying to eradicate what I represent." Eli nodded, satisfied. "Now we have something to work with. Let's move." They gathered their meager supplies and headed deeper into the forbidden zone, away from the smoke. As they traveled, Eli continued Valira's training, teaching her to recognize and utilize emotional states that the Ascari had conditioned her to suppress. By midday, they had reached a peculiar section of the forest where the radiation-mutated plants grew in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, forming corridors and chambers like a living labyrinth. "This place feels conscious," Eli observed, touching one of the strangely pulsing vines. "Bio-responsive flora," Valira explained. "The radiation altered their cellular structure, creating a primitive form of neural network. They respond to emotional emanations." Eli's eyes widened. That's why the Ascari avoid this place. Their emotional suppression would make them effectively invisible to these plants. And more emotionally expressive beings would be, Valira began. Visible, Eli finished. Like beacons. He looked around with new understanding. The plants are reacting to us, to our emotional states. As if confirming his theory, the vegetation around them shifted subtly, creating a clearer path in the direction they had been traveling. It's responding to us, Valira whispered, watching as flowering vines curved overhead, their luminescent blooms brightening. No, Eli corrected gently. It's responding to you, to the emotions you're now allowing yourself to feel. They followed the path created by the responsive plants, moving deeper into the heart of the forbidden zone. For hours, they traveled unmolested, the forest itself seeming to guide and protect them. But as dusk approached, the vegetation suddenly withdrew, coiling away as if in fear. Moments later, they heard the distinctive hum of Ascari hover transports. "They've found us," Valira said, reaching for her dagger. Eli grabbed her arm. "Wait! Remember what we discussed about the plants responding to emotion? If the Ascari are approaching, it means they've found a way to track us despite the bioresponsive flora. How? I don't know. But direct confrontation isn't the answer." Eli scanned their surroundings. "We need to use their expectations against them. What would standard Ascari training dictate in this situation?" Valira thought for a moment. "Retreat to defensible ground, establish a perimeter, wait for reinforcements." "So that's exactly what we won't do," Eli said. "Instead, we're going to move toward them, but not to attack, to observe and then circumvent." Using the stealth techniques Valira had been taught as an Ascari warrior, they crept toward the sound of the approaching forces. From the cover of dense foliage, they watched as a squad of 10 genetic purification unit soldiers established a search pattern, led by none other than General Nizra herself. "She's leading the hunt personally," Valira whispered. "That's unusual." Eli studied the general through the leaves. "There's something about her that seems familiar to you, isn't there?" Valira started to deny it, then paused, considering. "Yes, something in her movements, her expressions, or rather, her lack of expression. It's almost like looking in a mirror," Eli suggested quietly. "She's suppressing even more than the average Ascari, isn't she?" Before Valira could respond, one of the soldiers activated a device that emitted a high-pitched sound. Immediately, the surrounding plants recoiled, creating a cleared area around the Ascari squad. "Emotional disruption technology," Valira explained. "It simulates the neural patterns of extreme fear. The plants are retreating from it." "Clever," Eli acknowledged. "They've found a way to manipulate the bioresponsive environment. But that gives me an idea." He turned to Valira. "You said the plants respond to emotional emanations. What if we could project a different emotion, one strong enough to override their disruptor?" "How would we do that?" Eli's expression became serious. "Through you. Your neural structure gives you greater emotional capacity than any Ascari, possibly greater than most humans. If you could project a powerful emotional state." "I don't know how to project emotions," Valira objected. "Actually, you've been doing it unconsciously since we entered this part of the forest," Eli said. "That's why the plants have been responding to us. I just need you to do it intentionally now, and with greater intensity." He took her hands in his, the contact sending an unexpected warmth through Valira's body. "I want you to focus on the strongest positive emotion you can access. Think of a moment when you felt connection, belonging, purpose." Valira frowned. "I have no such memories." "Then create one," Eli suggested. "Imagine what it would feel like to be accepted completely for who you are, to be valued not despite your differences, but because of them." Valira closed her eyes, struggling with the concept. In her entire life, She had never experienced such acceptance. "I can't," she admitted finally. Eli studied her face for a moment, then made a decision. "Then use me. Use this moment. Whatever you're feeling right now, focus on that and amplify it." What was she feeling? Valira examined her emotional state with the awareness Eli had been teaching her. There was fear, certainly, determination, but also something else, something new and unfamiliar in her experience. A warmth when she looked at this human who had treated her not as defective, but as valuable, who had seen her differences as strengths rather than flaws. Trust. That was it. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing trust. Valira focused on this feeling, allowing it to expand within her, as Eli had taught her. To her astonishment, the plants around them began to respond immediately, unfurling, extending, glowing with increased luminescence. "It's working," Eli whispered. "Keep going." The vegetation continued to react, creating a wave of movement that spread outward from their position. As it reached the edge of the cleared area where the Ascari squad was operating, the plants began to override the effects of the emotional disruptor, extending tendrils into the space. "Impossible!" they heard General Nizra snap. "Increase the disruptor's power!" But the plants continued their advance, responding to Valira's projected emotion with increasing vigor. Flowering vines descended from overhead, bioluminescent blooms casting a blue glow over the confused Ascari soldiers. "Now," Eli whispered, "while they're distracted, we need to circle around them." They began to move, using the increasingly dense vegetation as cover. The plants seemed to cooperate, creating a path for them while simultaneously hampering the Ascari pursuit. They had nearly cleared the area when a shout went up. "There! Movement to the west!" Energy fire erupted around them, burning through the protective foliage. Eli pushed Valira down as a bolt passed over them, scorching the air. "We need to split up," he said urgently. "I'll draw their fire. You circle back and—" "No," Valira cut him off. "We stay together." More energy fire peppered their position. The plants were recoiling from the heat and destruction, their protective canopy thinning. "We don't have a choice," Eli insisted. "They'll capture both of us if we—" He never finished the sentence. A bolt of energy caught him in the side, sending him sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. "Eli!" Valera moved to him, checking the wound. It was serious, a deep energy burn that had penetrated his abdomen. "Go!" he gasped, pushing weakly at her. "Get away while you can." Instead, Valera lifted him, displaying the enhanced strength typical of Ascari physiology. "I told you, we stay together." She carried him deeper into the forest as energy bolts sliced through the vegetation around them. Behind them, she could hear General Nizra shouting orders, organizing her forces for pursuit. The plants responded to Valira's desperate determination, closing behind her to hamper the Ascari advance. But it wouldn't hold them for long. Eli's breathing had become labored, his skin pale. "Put me down," he managed. "I'll only slow you down." Valira ignored him, continuing to move as fast as she could while carrying his weight. Her mind raced, searching for options, for escape routes, for any possibility of survival. And then, unexpectedly, she found one. Ahead, barely visible through the dense foliage, stood a structure, ancient, partially reclaimed by the forest, but unmistakably artificial. Some relic of the war that had created the Forbidden Zone. Valira headed for it, hope flaring within her. As they approached, she saw that it was a bunker of some kind, its entrance half hidden by mutated vines. She shifted Eli's weight and forced the door open, then carried him inside. The interior was dark but intact, a single large chamber filled with ancient equipment, most of it no longer functional. Valira laid Eli gently on a clear section of floor and examined his wound more carefully. The energy bolt had caused severe internal damage. Without proper medical attention, he wouldn't survive more than a few hours. How bad? He asked, his voice weak but still lucid. Not good, Valera admitted, but I've seen worse. It was a lie, and from his slight smile, Eli knew it. Not much of a poker face, are you? Poker face? Human expression. Means you're not good at hiding your emotions. He coughed, a thin line of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. Which is actually a good thing. Means the conditioning is wearing off. Valera tore strips from her uniform to create a makeshift bandage. Save your strength. I need to secure the entrance before they track us here. She worked quickly, using debris from the bunker to barricade the door. It wouldn't stop a determined Askari force for long, but it might buy them some time. When she returned to Eli's side, his condition had deteriorated further. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. Listen, he said, reaching for her hand. There's something you need to know. Something important. Valera took his hand, surprised at how natural the gesture felt. I'm listening. Your neural compatibility with humans. It's not random. It's evidence of connection. He paused, gathering strength. Humans and Askari must have crossed paths before. Interbred. Possibly. Your defect might actually be ancestral DNA reasserting itself. Valera stared at him. That's impossible. The historical records can be altered. Eli finished for her. Histories are written by the victors, and it sounds like your genetic council has been victorious for a very long time. Outside, they could hear the Askari forces approaching, the sound of energy weapons as they cleared a path through the defensive vegetation. They're coming, Valera said, drawing her dagger. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Eli's grip on her hand tightened. No, there's a better way. With visible effort, he reached into his pocket and removed a small data crystal. This contains everything I've learned about psychological warfare, emotion as a weapon, mind as a battlefield. He pressed the crystal into her palm. Don't live for revenge, Valera. Live to change the game. Before she could respond, the bunker door exploded inward. General Nizra stood in the opening, flanked by her elite guards, energy rifles aimed at Valera. Surrender the human and submit to genetic processing, Nizra commanded, her voice as cold and mechanical as ever. Valera stood, positioning herself between the Askari and Eli. And if I refuse? Then you will be terminated as a genetic aberration, Nizra replied. The human will be dissected for scientific study. Choose. Valera felt something stir within her, a clarity and purpose unlike anything she had experienced before. Using the techniques Eli had taught her, she channeled her emotions not into rage, but into focused determination. I choose option 3, she said calmly. Before Nizra could respond, Valera moved with a speed and precision that surprised even the Askari general. She targeted not the soldiers' weapons or bodies, but the emotional disruptor device one of them carried. With a precise throw of her dagger, she destroyed the device, which exploded in a shower of sparks. Immediately, the bio-responsive flora surged forward, responding to the sudden release of emotional energy in the area. Vines and tendrils swept through the doorway, wrapping around the Askari soldiers, reacting to their suppressed fear and confusion. Only Nizra seemed immune, her emotional suppression so complete that the plants largely ignored her. She stepped forward, drawing her ceremonial sword, the mark of her rank. Impressive, aberration, but ultimately futile. Valera stood her ground. You call me aberration, General, but we both know that's not true, don't we? We both know what I really am. Nizra's perfect features showed a flicker of something, the faintest crack in her emotional armor. You are a genetic mistake, nothing more. No, Valera countered. I am what you could have been, what you were meant to be, before they conditioned it out of you. She took a step closer. I recognize the signs now. the overcompensation, the fanatical adherence to the genetic ideal. You weren't born perfect either, were you, General? Nizra's sword wavered almost imperceptibly. Silence! You underwent the resequencing procedures, Valira continued, the realization dawning on her. Multiple times, from the look of you. Painful, wasn't it? Rewriting your own DNA to match their standard of perfection. I was purified, Nizra hissed. Made better. Made obedient, Valira corrected. Made controllable. With a cry of rage, the first genuine emotion Valira had ever seen her display, Nizra attacked, her sword slicing through the air with lethal precision. Valira dodged, moving with a fluidity that surprised both of them. Her round pupils, always considered a defect, allowed her a wider field of vision than the elliptical Ascari standard. She used this advantage now, seeing angles and opportunities that Nizra could not. The fight was brief, but intense. Nizra had superior training and equipment, but Valira had something the general had sacrificed long ago, the integrated power of emotion and reason working in harmony. It ended when one of the younger Ascari soldiers, entangled in the bioresponsive vines, suddenly turned her weapon on Nizra, firing a stun blast that dropped the general to the floor. The soldier, barely more than a girl, stared at Valira with wide eyes. You're like me, she whispered, pulling back her uniform collar to reveal a small genetic deformity, 6 fingers instead of the Ascari standard 5. Valira nodded, understanding instantly. What's your name? Lyria, the young soldier replied. 6th level genetic anomaly, retained for military utility. Not anymore, Lyria, Valira said firmly. You're not an anomaly. You're the future. With Nizra unconscious, and the other soldiers either entangled or uncertain, Valira returned to Eli's side. His condition had worsened during the confrontation. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Eli, she called, taking his hand again. We need to move. Can you stand? His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with effort. Did we win? For the moment, Valira confirmed. But we need to get you medical attention. Eli shook his head weakly. Too late for that, but not too late for you. He squeezed her hand. Remember what I said. Don't live for revenge. Live to change the game. His eyes closed again, his breathing becoming more labored. Valira felt a new emotion, a tearing, wrenching feeling in her chest that made it hard to breathe. I don't know how to change the game without you, she admitted, the words catching in her throat. Eli's lips curved in a faint smile. Yes, you do. You just haven't realized it yet. His voice was barely audible now. You weren't born wrong, Valira. You were born exactly right, for a different purpose than they intended. As he slipped into unconsciousness, Valira made her decision. If she couldn't save Eli alone, she would find someone who could. And in the process, she would deliver the message he had entrusted to her, a message that might change everything for those like her. With Lyria's help, she secured the other Ascari soldiers and constructed a makeshift stretcher for Eli. As they prepared to leave, Valira looked down at General Nizra's unconscious form. What about her? Lyria asked. Valira considered for a moment, then reached down and removed Nizra's identification chip, the key to Ascari central systems. We take what we need and leave her to face the consequences of failure, Valira decided. She made her choice long ago. Together, Valira and Lyria carried Eli from the bunker, heading deeper into the Forbidden Zone, toward a community of outcasts that Lyria knew of. People who had been rejected by Ascari society for their genetic imperfections. As they traveled, the bio-responsive flora seemed to guide them, creating paths where none had existed before, responding to the emotional awakening that Eli had triggered in Valira, an awakening that had already begun to spread. Behind them, in the ancient bunker, General Nizra regained consciousness alone, surrounded by the failure of her mission and the first stirrings of doubt in a mind that had been conditioned to certainty. And in the sterile chambers of the Genetic Council, High Matron Zayla received the report of the failed capture with an expression that, for the first time in decades, contained a trace of something other than cold calculation. Something that might, in a less controlled society, have been recognized as hope. Part 4. The outcast stands before the court and smiles. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the bunker. Valira stood at the edge of a hidden settlement, deep within the Forbidden Zone, watching as the community's healers worked to save Eli's life. The settlement, known simply as Haven, was home to hundreds of genetic anomalies who had escaped Ascari purification. Lyria approached, her 6-fingered hand holding a container of water. "They've stabilized him," she reported. "Dr. Karen says the next 12 hours will be critical." Valira nodded, unable to take her eyes off Eli's still form. The head healer, an Ascari with scaled skin, rather than the standard smooth dermis, had performed an impressive feat of medical ingenuity to repair the energy weapon damage. "If he survives," Lyria continued, "he'll need weeks to recover fully." "We don't have weeks," Valira replied, her mind already working through the implications of the data crystal Eli had given her. "The Genetic Council will regroup, send more forces. They can't allow what we represent to exist." Lyria studied her with curious eyes. "And what exactly do we represent?" Valira turned to face the younger woman. "The truth. That genetic diversity isn't a weakness. It's survival. That the Ascari have engineered themselves into an evolutionary dead end by eliminating variation." "But what can we do against the entire council?" Lyria asked. "We're outcasts, anomalies. We have something they don't," Valira said, holding up the data crystal. "Knowledge of how to fight a different kind of battle, one they're not equipped for." She explained what she had learned from Eli, about psychological warfare, about using emotion as both shield and weapon, about how the Ascari's rigid suppression of emotional response had created a vulnerability that could be exploited. "The Council doesn't fear our genetic differences," Valira concluded. "They fear what those differences represent, the potential for independent thought, for resistance to control, for evolutionary adaptation that they can't predict or manage." Lyria considered this. "So what are you proposing?" "Not an attack," Valira said firmly. "Not direct resistance. Those are the strategies they're prepared for. Instead, we use their own system against them. We create change from within." "How?" Valira held up General Nizra's identification chip. "With this, it gives us access to the central communication systems. And with the psychological warfare data from Eli, we can craft a message that will reach not just the Council, but every Ascari who has ever doubted, ever questioned, ever felt the weight of genetic conformity." The plan took shape over the next day, as Valira worked with the leaders of Haven to analyze Eli's data crystal. It contained not just tactical information on psychological warfare, but detailed analyses of how emotional suppression affected cognitive function, decision-making, and social cohesion. Most importantly, it included methods for breaking through conditioned responses, techniques that could help awaken the emotional intelligence that lay dormant in many Ascari, suppressed but not eliminated by generations of genetic engineering. Dr. Karan, the scaled healer, was particularly interested in the neural mapping data. "This confirms what some of us have suspected for years," she said, examining the displays. "The Ascari didn't evolve naturally into emotional suppression. They were engineered that way, and not that long ago, evolutionarily speaking." "How can you tell?" Valira asked. "The neural architecture is too complex to have been eliminated through natural selection," Karan explained. "It's been suppressed, overlaid with conditioning and targeted genetic modifications, but the underlying structures remain intact. That's why your defect manifested. Your genetics somehow bypassed the suppression mechanisms. And there are others like me? Karan gestured around at the inhabitants of Haven. All of us, to varying degrees. Some express physical differences, others neurological ones. But we all represent the diversity that the Council has tried to eliminate. As Eli's condition gradually stabilized, Valira finalized her plan. Using Nizra's identification chip, she would infiltrate the capital city and access the central communication network during the Festival of Genetic Harmony, an annual celebration where all Askari gathered to reaffirm their commitment to genetic purity.
It's suicide, Lyria objected. Even with the General's chip, you'll be recognized.
I'm counting on it, Valira replied. My capture won't be the failure of the mission. It will be part of it. The night before her departure, Valira sat beside Eli's bed. He had regained consciousness briefly earlier in the day, long enough to understand and approve her plan before slipping back into healing sleep.
I don't know if this will work, she admitted to his unconscious form. But you taught me something important, that change doesn't always come through force. Sometimes it comes through understanding.
She took his hand, still surprised at how natural the gesture felt. You showed me that I wasn't broken, just wired differently. Now I need to show my people the same truth. In the morning, Valira prepared to leave. The inhabitants of Haven had provided her with supplies and a small but powerful data transmitter constructed from salvage technology. Dr. Karen had also given her a neural stabilizer, a device that would help her maintain emotional awareness even under stress. Remember, the doctor cautioned, the Council will try to use emotional triggers against you. Shame, isolation, the conditioned need for conformity. The stabilizer will help, but ultimately, your awareness is your strongest defense. Lyria insisted on accompanying her to the edge of Haven.
Are you sure you want to do this alone?
Valira nodded. One person has a better chance of infiltrating the city, and someone needs to stay and lead if I don't return.
Lead what?
Lyria asked. Whatever comes next, Valira replied. Whether I succeed or fail, nothing will be the same after today. The journey to the capital took most of the day. As Valira approached the city's outskirts, she activated Nizra's identification chip, allowing her to pass through the outer security perimeters unchallenged. The chip's high-level clearance prevented the usual genetic scans that would have immediately identified her. The capital of Ivera was a monument to Askari ideals of perfection, all clean lines and mathematical precision, without the organic irregularity found in most cities. The buildings rose in perfect geometric patterns, their surfaces a uniform white that reflected the planet's blue-tinged sunlight. Askari moved through the streets with mechanical efficiency, their interactions formal and minimal. Watching them, Valira was struck by how different they appeared to her now, not superior as she had once believed, but diminished, lacking the vibrancy and complexity she had glimpsed in Eli and the inhabitants of Haven. The Festival of Genetic Harmony was centered in the Grand Compliance Hall, a massive structure at the city's heart, where the Genetic Council conducted its most important business. Today, it would be filled with thousands of Askari, from the highest-ranking matrons to the lowest-tier workers, all gathered to celebrate their genetic perfection. Valira's plan relied on this gathering. The central communication system, which normally broadcast only official pronouncements, would be configured to address the entire assembly, and, by extension, the entire planet. Using Nizra's chip, Valira entered the administrative level of the compliance hall. She moved with purpose, adopting the rigid posture and expressionless demeanor of a high-ranking officer. No one questioned her presence. The identification chip's authorization overrode any potential concerns. She located the central communication hub, a sterile room filled with advanced technology. Two technicians looked up in surprise as she entered. This area is restricted during the festival, one began, then stopped as she displayed Nizra's chip. General, We weren't informed. Emergency override, Valira stated flatly, imitating Nizra's clipped tones. Council authorization. The technicians hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. As they left, Valira locked the door behind them and quickly began accessing the system. The data transmitter from Haven connected seamlessly with the Ascari technology. Within minutes, Valira had uploaded the contents of Eli's data crystal into the communication network, set to broadcast throughout the compliance hall and across all Ascari channels simultaneously. But that was only the first part of her plan. The most crucial element would be her own testimony, her personal challenge to the system that had labeled her defective. As she prepared the final broadcast sequence, an alarm sounded. They had discovered the deception sooner than she had anticipated. Valira worked faster, fingers flying across the control panel. She needed only a few more minutes to complete the upload and initiate the broadcast. The door to the communication hub shuddered as security forces attempted to override the lock. Just as the upload completed, the door burst open. A squad of elite guards rushed in, weapons raised, followed by a figure Valira had not expected to see. Her mother, High Matron Zayla. Valira. Zayla's voice was as cold and formal as ever, but something flickered in her eyes. Something Valira might not have recognized before her time with Eli. Uncertainty. Mother, Valira acknowledged, stepping away from the control panel. Or should I address you as High Matron? You will address me as your judge, Zayla replied. You have committed crimes against the genetic purity of the Ascari. You will be taken directly to the council for immediate processing. Valira didn't resist as the guards secured her. Everything was proceeding according to plan, better than planned, with her mother's direct involvement. The festival gathering is complete, she asked, as they led her from the room. All are assembled, Zayla confirmed, suspicion evident in her tone. Why do you ask? Valira allowed herself a small smile. Excellent timing. They escorted her through the administrative corridors and into the main chamber of the compliance hall. Thousands of Ascari sat in perfect rows, their faces uniformly attentive as they listened to a speaker extolling the virtues of genetic conformity. The guards brought Valira to the central platform, where the 7 members of the Genetic Council sat in elevated chairs. A murmur, the closest thing to disruption in Ascari gatherings, spread through the assembly as they recognized the genetic anomaly being presented before the council. Silence, commanded the chief matron, the highest authority on Ivera. We will maintain order. The vast hall grew quiet again, though Valira could sense a tension that hadn't been present before. Her appearance, a known genetic anomaly boldly present at the Festival of Genetic Harmony, was unprecedented. Valira, daughter of High Matron Zayla, the chief matron intoned. You stand accused of genetic nonconformity, evasion of purification protocols, contamination through contact with non-Ascari species, and sabotage of official systems. How do you respond? Before Valira could answer, the massive display screens throughout the hall suddenly activated. Eli's data began streaming across them, neural maps showing the suppressed emotional centers in Ascari brains, historical records indicating deliberate genetic manipulation, evidence of the evolutionary advantages of diversity. What is this? The chief matron demanded, rising from her chair. Valira stepped forward, her voice amplified by the hall's acoustic design. This is truth, chief matron. The truth the council has suppressed for generations. The technicians scrambled to shut down the displays, but the system had been locked by Valera's programming. The data continued to stream, now accompanied by images from Haven, genetic anomalies, living productive, innovative lives away from Ascari control. I speak not just to the council, but to all Ascari, Valira continued, her voice carrying throughout the hall and across the planet via the communication network. I speak to those who have felt different, who have questioned, who have suppressed their doubts to conform. She moved to the center of the platform, commanding attention with a presence she had never before allowed herself to display. We have been told that genetic purity equals strength, that emotional suppression equals rationality, that conformity equals progress. These are lies. The chief matron signaled to the guards, "Remove her!" But Valera continued, raising her voice. "Look at the evidence before you. The Ascari were not always as we are now. Our ancestors possessed the full range of emotional capacity, the very traits now labeled as defects. Those traits weren't eliminated through evolution, but suppressed through deliberate engineering by those who sought control rather than progress." The guards hesitated, their attention drawn to the displays where the evidence of Valera's claims was clearly presented. "My round pupils aren't a defect. They're a reversion to our original genetics. My emotional capacity isn't a weakness. It's an evolutionary advantage that allows for adaptation, innovation, and true connection." Throughout the hall, Valera could see signs of impact. Ascari shifting uncomfortably, exchanging glances, some even displaying visible emotional responses for perhaps the first time in their lives. "For too long, we have accepted the Council's definition of perfection," she pressed on. "But true perfection isn't uniformity. It's the capacity to evolve, to adapt, to thrive through diversity." The chief matron had abandoned decorum now, shouting for security, for the communication system to be shut down. But the damage was done. Across Ivera, Ascari were seeing the evidence, hearing Valera's words, beginning to question centuries of conditioning. "Look around you," Valera challenged, gesturing to the assembly. "How many of you have hidden aspects of yourselves to conform? How many have undergone painful genetic modification to meet an arbitrary standard? How many have children or siblings who were processed for showing the very traits that make us sentient?" A commotion erupted at the back of the hall. A group of Ascari rose from their seats, removing head coverings or adjusting uniforms to reveal their own genetic anomalies, variations in skin patterns, non-standard eye formations, subtle differences that would normally be hidden at all costs. "You see," Valera called out, "we are everywhere. We are Ascari too, and we will no longer accept being labeled as defective." High Matron Zela stepped forward, her perfect features composed, but her voice less certain than usual. "The stability of our society depends on genetic conformity. Without it, we descend into chaos." "Does this look like chaos?" Valera countered, gesturing to the images of Haven still streaming on the displays. "They have built a community that embraces diversity, yet maintains harmony. They have developed innovations our scientists couldn't conceive, because true creativity requires the emotional intelligence we've been conditioned to suppress." The chief matron slammed her ceremonial staff against the platform. "Enough, guards! Remove this aberration and all those displaying nonconformity." But as the guards moved to obey, something unprecedented occurred. Throughout the hall, more Ascari stood, dozens, then hundreds. Not all revealed genetic variations. Many appeared perfectly standard. But their act of standing, of showing solidarity, was itself a form of rebellion unheard of in Ascari society. "You cannot process us all," one called out, an older male Ascari, with a prominent position in the scientific division. "And if you try, who will remain to maintain your perfect society?" The council members exchanged alarmed glances as the situation slipped beyond their control. This was not the mechanical compliance they were accustomed to managing. Valera seized the moment. "I do not call for the destruction of Ascari society. I call for its evolution, for a return to the true strength of our species, our capacity for adaptation, for innovation, for connection." She turned to face the council directly. "You fear emotion because it cannot be perfectly controlled, but that very unpredictability is what drives progress. Look at the evidence." She gestured to the data still streaming across the displays. Societies that embrace diversity outperform homogeneous ones in every metric except predictability. The hall had fallen into a tense silence. The assembled Askari, waiting to see how the council would respond to this unprecedented challenge. After a long moment, the chief matron spoke, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. These disruptions will cease immediately. A planet-wide genetic compliance scan will begin tomorrow. All displaying nonconformity will be processed according to protocol. She fixed her elliptical pupils on Valira. As for this aberration, she will be isolated and studied to determine how such defective genetics could produce such dangerous deviancy. Valira met her gaze without flinching. You can silence me, Chief Matron, but you cannot unsee what has been seen today. You cannot unlearn what has been learned. As the guards moved to take her away, a new voice rang out from the assembly. I motion for a suspension of proceedings. All eyes turned to the speaker, a middle-aged Askari female with the insignia of the Judicial Division on her uniform. On what grounds? The chief matron demanded. On the grounds that significant new evidence has been presented that requires evaluation before judgment can be rendered. The judicial officer replied formally. According to Protocol 247B of Askari Legal Code, any proceeding must be suspended when foundational assumptions are challenged by credible evidence. A murmur spread through the hall. The judicial officer was citing actual Askari law, the same rigid system the council had always used to maintain control. The chief matron conferred urgently with the other council members. They were trapped by their own system. To deny the motion would be to violate the very protocols they claimed to uphold. Motion granted, the chief matron finally announced, her voice tight with suppressed fury. Proceedings are suspended for evaluation of evidence. The aberration will remain in custody during this period. It wasn't victory, but it was opportunity. Exactly what Valira had hoped for. As the guards led her from the platform, she caught her mother's eye. For the first time in Valira's memory, High Matron Zayla's perfect composure slipped, revealing a complex mixture of emotions beneath. In that moment, Valira knew her message had reached at least one person who mattered. As she was escorted from the compliance hall, reports were already coming in of disturbances throughout the capital. Askari publicly revealing genetic variations, questions being raised in formal contexts, the rigid structure of society developing its first significant cracks in centuries. And across the planet, in hidden enclaves like Haven, those who had been cast out for their differences watched the unfolding events with hope they had never dared to feel before. In her holding cell, Valira closed her eyes and focused on the techniques Eli had taught her, channeling her emotions into clarity rather than anxiety, preparing herself for what would come next. This was only the beginning. The real work of changing Askari society had just begun. Outside her cell, the first ripples of revolution spread through a civilization that had forgotten what change felt like. And in the high chambers of the Genetic Council, an emergency session began. The 7 most powerful Askari on Avera facing a threat they had never anticipated. The truth about their own nature, exposed for all to see. 3 days after her public testimony, Valira received an unexpected visitor in her holding cell. General Nizra, her perfect features marred by a new scar across her right cheek, stood rigidly before the energy barrier. You've created quite a disturbance, Nizra stated, her voice devoid of emotion as always. Valira remained seated, watching the general with newfound understanding. Not created, revealed. The council has been in continuous session since your performance. Reports of non-conformity displays have increased 7,000%. Productivity in essential sectors has decreased by 38%. Nizra recited the statistics as if they were a condemnation. And how does that make you feel, General? Valira asked quietly. Nizra's perfect posture stiffened further. Feel? I do not engage in emotional responses. I am a perfect example of Askari genetics. Perfect through how many resequencing procedures? Valira countered. 7, wasn't it? Each more painful than the last as your body fought against the unnatural modifications. The general's hand moved unconsciously to the ritual scarification on her face. Marks Valira, now recognized as covering evidence of genetic resequencing. You've been relieved of duty, Valira observed, noting the absence of Nizra's insignia. Temporarily, Nizra snapped, a flash of anger breaking through her control. While the Council investigates alleged violations of protocol during your pursuit, the torture of prisoners, Valira translated, the excessive force, the destruction of protected biological zones. Nizra didn't deny it. Instead, she stepped closer to the barrier, lowering her voice. You think you've won something. You haven't. The Council will contain this disruption. They always do. Not this time, Valira replied with quiet confidence. Because this time, the truth is out. Not just about me, or about those like me, but about all Ascari, about what we were before they engineered us into these controlled versions of ourselves. Nizra studied her with cold intensity. Where is the human? Safe, Valira answered, beyond your reach. His ship contained advanced technology, weapons, information the Council requires. Valira smiled slightly. The only weapon that mattered was knowledge, General, and that weapon has already been deployed. Nizra turned to leave, then paused. The Council will offer you a choice, she said without turning around. Genetic resequencing to correct your anomalies, or permanent exile. Choose wisely. There's a third option, Valera called after her. The Council could recognize that they've been wrong. That genetic diversity is strength, not weakness. Nizra's shoulders tensed visibly. The Council does not admit error. Then, perhaps, Valera suggested, the Council itself is the error that needs correction. After Nizra departed, Valera returned to her meditation, focusing on maintaining emotional clarity while preparing for whatever came next. The visit had confirmed what she already suspected. The Council was destabilized, uncertain how to proceed in the face of widespread questioning of their authority. It was exactly the outcome Eli's psychological warfare tactics had predicted. By challenging the foundational beliefs of Ascari society, rather than directly confronting its power structure, Valera had created a crisis the Council couldn't simply suppress through force. On the 10th day of her confinement, High Matron Zayla arrived. Unlike Nizra, she deactivated the energy barrier and entered the cell, dismissing the guards with a gesture. Mother and daughter faced each other in silence for a long moment. The Council has reached a decision, Zayla finally stated, her voice formal as always, but lacking its usual certainty. And you've come to deliver it personally, Valira observed. An unusual courtesy for a genetic aberration. Zayla's perfect features revealed nothing, but her hands, clasped tightly before her, betrayed tension. The evidence you presented has been disturbing. The historical records, in particular, require further investigation. You mean the evidence that Ascari once possessed the full range of emotional capacity? That our current form is the result of genetic engineering rather than natural evolution? Among other findings, Zayla acknowledged stiffly. Valira studied her mother carefully. You already knew, didn't you? The Council knew the truth about our history. Zayla didn't answer directly. The Council has decided to establish a research division to investigate these claims thoroughly. During this investigation, all processing of genetic nonconformities will be suspended. It was more than Valira had dared hope for. A complete halt to the purification protocols that had claimed so many lives. And what of me? She asked. You will be released, Zayla stated, but not permitted to remain in Ascari cities. You will return to the place you found refuge and remain there until the Council completes its investigation. Exile, but not punishment. A compromise that allowed the Council to save face while creating space for change. And the others? Those who revealed their nonconformities during the festival? They will be monitored but not processed. Zayla replied. The council recognizes that hasty action would be counterproductive at this time. Valera nodded slowly. And what about you, Mother? Not as High Matron Zayla, but as the woman who gave birth to a daughter with round pupils and then rejected her. What do you think of all this? For the first time in Valera's memory, her mother appeared genuinely uncertain. I followed protocol, as I was trained to do. And now, when protocol itself is in question? Zayla turned away slightly. I require time to process these developments. It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but coming from a woman who had spent her entire life suppressing any hint of emotional response or uncertainty. It was a significant admission. I understand, Valera said softly. Processing emotions takes practice when you've been conditioned to ignore them. Zayla faced her again, and for a brief moment, Valera thought she saw something in her mother's eyes, a flicker of the connection that might have existed between them in a different society. The human, Zayla said abruptly. We've received reports that he survived. He did, Valera confirmed. His knowledge of psychological warfare techniques is concerning to the council. Valera smiled slightly. Only to those who fear the truth about themselves. Zayla moved toward the exit, then paused. When you return to the settlement, tell the human that the council wishes to establish diplomatic contact with Earth authorities. Valera couldn't hide her surprise. After centuries of isolation? Circumstances change, Zayla replied formally. Adaptation is logical. After her mother left, Valera remained in the cell, processing what had just occurred. It wasn't total victory. The council still held power, still believed in their right to control Ascari genetics. But the first cracks had appeared in their perfect system, and through those cracks, change would inevitably flow. The next morning, she was escorted to the edge of the city and released. No guards followed as she made her way toward the Forbidden Zone. The council was allowing her to return to Haven, a tacit acknowledgement of the settlement's right to exist. As she walked, Valera reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. She had begun this journey as a genetic anomaly, a defect to be hidden and eventually purged. Now she returned as something else, a catalyst for change, a symbol of the diversity the Ascari had tried to engineer away. And somewhere in Haven, Eli waited, the human whose understanding of psychology had provided the tools to challenge an entire civilization, and whose recognition of Valera's true nature had awakened her to possibilities she had never imagined. She quickened her pace, eager to share the news of the council's decision and to see for herself that Eli was healing. There was much work ahead. The council's concessions were just the beginning, but for the first time, Valera allowed herself to feel something the Ascari had long considered dangerous and primitive: hope. Part 5. Born wrong here, but built for him. The return journey to Haven took Valera through the heart of the Forbidden Zone, where the bio-responsive flora seemed to recognize her, creating clear paths and offering luminescent blooms that lit her way as darkness fell. The plants reacted to her emotional state, her mixture of hope, determination, and anticipation creating patterns of growth unlike anything she had seen before. By the time she reached the hidden settlement 2 days later, word of her approach had preceded her. The inhabitants of Haven, hundreds of genetic anomalies who had escaped Ascari purification, gathered to welcome her, their faces showing the open emotion that marked them as different from mainstream Ascari society. Lyria was the first to greet her, the young soldier's six-fingered hand clasping Valera's arm in the warrior's greeting she had been taught, despite her genetic defect. "We've been monitoring the official broadcasts," Lyria said excitedly. "Is it true? The council has suspended all processing of nonconformities?" Valera nodded, allowing her own emotions to show in a way that still felt unfamiliar but increasingly natural. For now, they're calling it a research period, but it's a significant concession. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, hope tempered with caution. The wariness of those who had suffered under Ascari intolerance for too long to trust sudden change. "And you?" Dr. Karen asked, her scaled skin catching the light as she stepped forward. "What did they do to you?" "Exile, officially," Valira replied. "Though they're calling it restricted residence while the investigation continues." Karan smiled wryly. "So we're all still outcasts, just slightly more official ones." "It's a beginning," Valira said firmly. "The council is destabilized. Questions are being asked that haven't been permitted for centuries. Change won't come overnight, but it has begun." She looked around at the assembled faces, searching for one in particular. "Eli?" "This way," Karan said, gesturing toward the medical facility. "He's been asking for you since he regained consciousness." Valira followed the doctor through the settlement, noting changes that had occurred during her absence. New structures had been built. The population seemingly increased. Haven was growing, preparing for what might come. "We've had new arrivals," Karan explained, noticing her observation. "Your broadcast reached more than just the capital. Genetic nonconformities across Ivera have been making their way here. Those who lived in hiding. Those who were scheduled for processing but escaped in the confusion. They reached the medical facility, a surprisingly sophisticated structure built from salvage technology and natural materials. Inside, in a private room. Eli sat propped up on a bed, his color much improved, though he still looked weak. His face brightened when he saw her, an unguarded display of emotion that still startled Valira, even as she found herself responding in kind. "You made it," he said, his voice stronger than she had expected. "And from what I hear, you caused quite a stir." Karan discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone. "Your data crystal was very effective," Valira acknowledged, taking a seat beside his bed. "The psychological warfare techniques worked exactly as you predicted." "Not the techniques," Eli corrected gently. Your courage in confronting the system that had rejected you. Your willingness to stand before them and speak truth." Valira felt an unfamiliar warmth in her face, what she now recognized as the physical manifestation of emotional response that the Ascari had conditioned themselves to suppress. "I had a good teacher," she said. "Someone who showed me that being different wasn't the same as being wrong." Eli smiled, reaching for her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. "So what happens now? I've been getting reports, but they're fragmented." Valira filled him in on the council's decision, the suspension of genetic processing, and the growing cracks in Ascari society's rigid conformity. "And there's something else," she added. "The council wants to establish diplomatic contact with Earth." Eli's eyebrows rose in surprise. "After centuries of isolation? That's unexpected." "They fear your psychological warfare techniques," Valira explained. "But I think they're also beginning to recognize the evolutionary dead end they've created. Your presence, and the data you provided, has forced them to confront uncomfortable truths." "Not just my presence," Eli said, squeezing her hand. "Yours. Your neural compatibility with humans was the key that unlocked everything else." They were silent for a moment, both contemplating the implications. "My mother mentioned reports that you had survived," Valera finally said. "They're monitoring Haven. Then—" "Of course they are," Eli replied without concern. "Surveillance is the first response of any authoritarian system when challenged. But monitoring is better than attacking, and it gives them the illusion of control, while real change happens under the surface." He shifted, wincing slightly at the movement. "Dr. Karen says I'll be mobile in another week or so. Limited activity at first, but improving." "Good," Valera said firmly. "Because there's something I want to show you when you're strong enough to travel." "What is it?"
A place deeper in the Forbidden Zone. Somewhere I found during my journey back here. Somewhere I think might be important to understanding the connection between humans and Ascari.
Eli's eyes lit with curiosity. Tell me more. It's better if you see it for yourself, Valira insisted. But I believe it may be evidence that our species have encountered each other before, long before the Genetic Council's recorded history. The next 3 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. As Eli gradually regained his strength, Haven transformed from a hidden refuge to a center of resistance. More genetic nonconformities arrived daily, bringing news from across Avera of growing challenges to the Council's authority. Reports filtered in of Ascari openly displaying genetic variations that would have been grounds for processing just weeks earlier. Scientific divisions were questioning the biological foundations of genetic purity. Even some members of the elite guard had begun to express doubts about the protocols they had enforced for generations. Through it all, Valira and Eli worked together to analyze the data flowing in, to identify patterns and opportunities, to guide the emerging movement toward constructive change, rather than destructive rebellion. The goal isn't to destroy Ascari society, Eli reminded the leaders of Haven during one planning session. It's to transform it, to reclaim the genetic diversity and emotional intelligence that were engineered away. Valira observed him during these meetings, noting how he never imposed his ideas, but rather asked questions that led others to their own conclusions. It was a subtle form of the psychological techniques he had taught her. Not manipulation, but liberation through understanding. When Eli was finally strong enough for extended travel, they set out together toward the location Valira had discovered. They traveled light, with only basic supplies and a few scientific instruments Eli had salvaged from his crashed shuttle. The journey took them deep into parts of the Forbidden Zone that even the inhabitants of Haven rarely visited, areas where the radiation-induced mutations had created ecosystems unlike anything elsewhere on Avera. The bio-responsive flora grew more complex here, reacting to their emotions in increasingly sophisticated ways. The plants are almost sentient, Eli observed as a cluster of luminescent vines formed a canopy over their resting place one evening. They're not just responding to emotional emanations, they're interpreting them, creating appropriate responses. The Ascari avoid this region entirely, Valira explained. They believe the radiation has rendered it permanently contaminated. Or perhaps they fear what it represents, Eli suggested. Evidence that mutation and adaptation aren't defects, but natural responses to changing conditions. On the third day of their journey, they reached their destination, a valley hidden between towering cliffs, accessible only through a narrow pass that would be easy to miss without the guidance of the bio-responsive plants. As they emerged into the valley, Eli stopped in astonishment. Before them stood ruins, clearly artificial structures that had once been buildings, now overgrown with mutated vegetation but still recognizably the work of intelligent beings. "This isn't Ascari architecture," he said immediately, studying the curved lines and organic forms that contrasted sharply with the rigid geometry of Ascari construction. "No," Valira agreed. "And according to official Ascari history, there were never settlements in the Forbidden Zone. These ruins don't exist." They approached carefully, Eli recording everything with a scanner from his equipment. The ruins covered several hectares, the remains of what appeared to have been a substantial settlement. "Look at this," Valira said, leading him to what seemed to be the central structure. Unlike the others, it had partially survived whatever cataclysm had destroyed the settlement. And on its walls were preserved images, murals depicting figures that made Eli inhale sharply. "These are humans," he said, studying the unmistakable forms. "And these," he pointed to figures alongside them. "These appear to be Ascari, but different from modern Ascari. Look at the eyes. The depicted Ascari had round pupils, like Valira's, like human eyes. And they're showing emotion," Valira added, indicating the clear expressions of joy, connection, and community evident in the ancient artwork. These Ascari aren't emotionally suppressed. They spent hours documenting the murals, piecing together a story that contradicted everything in official Ascari history. The images showed humans and Ascari living together, collaborating, even, most shockingly, forming families together. "This explains your neural compatibility," Eli said, as the implications became clear. "Humans and Ascari interbred. We share ancestry. Which means my defect isn't a defect at all," Valira concluded. "It's a genetic memory, traits from those ancient hybrid communities reasserting themselves after centuries of suppression." They found more evidence as they explored, artifacts that combined human and Ascari design elements, remnants of technology that matched neither current human nor Ascari developments, but seemed to incorporate aspects of both. "This settlement was destroyed deliberately," Eli observed, noting the pattern of damage. "Not by natural disaster or war, but by systematic demolition." "The beginning of the genetic purification," Valera surmised. "The first step in erasing the evidence of human Ascari integration." As night fell, they made camp within the ruins, surrounded by the ghosts of a forgotten history. The bioresponsive plants created a protective enclosure around them, their bioluminescence providing gentle illumination. "What will you do with this discovery?" Eli asked, as they sat together, watching the alien stars emerge overhead. "Share it," Valera replied, without hesitation. "The Council can dispute theories and question data, but these ruins are physical evidence that cannot be denied. They prove that genetic diversity was once the norm for Ascari, that emotional expression was natural, that contact with humans led to collaboration rather than contamination." "It will change everything," Eli said. "The foundation of Ascari society is built on the myth of genetic purity, on the belief that emotional suppression represents evolutionary advancement." "Those foundations were already cracking," Valira pointed out. "This will simply accelerate the process." They fell silent, contemplating the magnitude of what they had discovered and what it would mean for both their species. "What about you?" Valira finally asked. "You've recovered enough to repair your shuttle. Earth will want to know about the Ascari's interest in diplomatic contact." Eli looked at her for a long moment, his expressive face showing a complexity of emotion that she was still learning to fully interpret. "Earth can wait," he said quietly. "There's important work to be done here first." Another silence fell between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken awareness. "When I crashed on Avera," Eli continued, "I was on a mission to study psychological effects of isolation on frontier colonies. Instead, I found a civilization that had engineered itself into emotional isolation, and one remarkable individual who had somehow maintained her capacity for connection, despite everything her society had done to suppress it." Valera felt that now familiar warmth in her face again. "I was considered defective," she reminded him. "You were considered wrong," Eli corrected, reaching for her hand. "But, as it turns out, you were exactly right. Not for Ascari society as it currently exists, but for building bridges between our species, for helping your people reclaim what they've lost." He hesitated, then added softly, "And perhaps for understanding a human who has always processed the world differently than others of his kind." The implication was clear. Just as Valira had been born wrong for Ascari society, Eli had never quite fit the human standard. Their differences, rather than being defects, had prepared them to recognize and value each other across the gulf of separate species. They spent 3 days documenting the ruins before beginning the journey back to Haven. By the time they returned, more changes had occurred. The settlement had grown further, with new arrivals bringing reports of increasing openness about genetic variation throughout Ascari society. Most significantly, an official communication had arrived from the Genetic Council, a formal request for representatives from Haven to participate in the research division investigating Ascari genetic history. They're trying to control the narrative, Lyria observed skeptically when the council's message was discussed. Of course they are, Eli agreed. But they're also opening a door that can't be easily closed again, by acknowledging Haven, by inviting participation rather than demanding submission. They've already conceded more than they realize. Valera had been quiet during the discussion, contemplating the evidence they had discovered and what it meant for her people's future. When she finally spoke, the assembly listened with the respect she had earned through her confrontation with the council. We should accept their invitation, she said firmly. Not because we trust the council, but because truth deserves a voice at their table. We'll present the evidence from the ruins, the proof of our shared history with humans, the reality that genetic diversity once defined Ascari civilization. She looked around at the gathered faces, scaled, spotted, asymmetrical, beautiful in their variation. For too long, we've been told we were born wrong. The truth is that we were born right for a different future than the one the council engineered. A future that embraces diversity as strength, emotion as intelligence, connection as progress. The assembly voted unanimously to accept the council's invitation, with Valera and Dr. Karen selected as their primary representatives. The negotiations would begin in 1 month, time enough to thoroughly document the ruins and prepare their case. As the meeting dispersed, Eli approached Valera. I've received a transmission from Earth, he said. They've picked up the signals from Avera and are sending a diplomatic vessel. They want me to act as liaison when it arrives. Valera felt a momentary tightness in her chest, another emotional response she was still learning to interpret. You'll be leaving, then? Not leaving, Eli corrected. Expanding our work. The reconnection between humans and Ascari needs to be handled carefully, with awareness of the psychological implications for both species. He took her hands, a gesture that had become natural between them. I'd like you to be part of that process. No one is better qualified to bridge the gap between our peoples. The tightness in Valera's chest eased, replaced by a spreading warmth. I would be pleased to assist, she said, still occasionally falling back on formal Ascari phrasing when emotions ran strong. Eli smiled, recognizing both what she said and what she felt. Then let's prepare. We have 2 societies to help transform. In the weeks that followed, Haven became the center of a growing movement that spread across Avera. As documentation of the ruins was shared, as the evidence of human-Ascari integration entered public discourse, the council's absolute authority continued to erode. General Nizra was formally removed from her position, though rumors suggested she had disappeared rather than face the consequences of her actions. High Matron Zayla, surprisingly, became an advocate for measured change within the council, never directly supporting Valera, but consistently arguing for a thorough examination of the evidence before any conclusions were drawn. The arrival of the Earth diplomatic vessel was met with mixed reactions across Ascari society: fear and resistance from traditionalists, cautious optimism from those embracing change. The ship established orbit around Avera, its crew remaining aboard while initial communications were established through Eli. 1 month after their discovery of the ruins, Valera stood with Eli on a hilltop overlooking Haven, watching the settlement bustling with activity below. The diplomatic negotiations with the council would begin the next day, with representatives from Earth joining remotely. Are you ready? Eli asked. Valera considered the question. I was trained to be a perfect Ascari warrior, emotionally suppressed, genetically conforming, obedient to the council. Instead, I'm about to help lead a fundamental transformation of my society while establishing contact with a species we were taught to fear. She turned to him, allowing her emotions to show freely on her face. No, I'm not ready by any traditional definition, but I'm exactly where I need to be. Eli smiled, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. You know, on Earth we have a concept called the right person at the right time. Individuals who emerge precisely when their unique qualities are most needed, even if those qualities weren't valued before.
Is that what we are? Valira asked. The right people at the right time?
I think we're something even more interesting, Eli replied. We're people who were considered wrong by our respective societies, yet turned out to be exactly right for each other, and perhaps for this moment in history. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared overhead. Somewhere among them, Earth shone, no longer the exiled planet of Ascari mythology, but a potential partner in a new understanding of what diversity and connection could mean for both species.
A genetic anomaly, Valira murmured, echoing the designation that had defined her life until recently.
But I was born. Exactly right for you. Eli's fingers intertwined with hers, the gesture symbolizing a connection that transcended species.
And you are the upgrade that both our worlds need.
Below them, Haven continued to grow, not just a settlement of outcasts now, but the birthplace of a new chapter in the history of two species that had once lived in harmony and might do so again. And deep in the Forbidden Zone, the ancient ruins stood as testimony to a truth the Council had tried to erase: that diversity breeds strength, that emotion enhances intelligence, and that different doesn't mean wrong. It simply means new possibilities waiting to be discovered. As night fell fully, a message arrived from a group of genetic nonconformities who had established their own community on Ivera's southern continent. They sought guidance on emotional reprogramming, the techniques Valera and Eli had developed to help Ascari reclaim their suppressed emotional intelligence.
Shall we answer them? Eli asked.
Valera nodded, her round pupils, once a mark of shame, now a badge of honor, reflecting the starlight. We'll teach them what we've learned, that emotions aren't weaknesses to be engineered away, but strengths to be integrated. That diversity isn't chaos, but opportunity. That being born differently doesn't mean being born wrong. It means being born for a purpose we might not yet understand. Together, they turned back toward Haven, toward the future they were helping to create. A future where differences were celebrated rather than suppressed, where connection replaced control, and where the boundaries between species began to dissolve in recognition of a shared capacity for growth, adaptation, and love. The story of Valira, once called Aberration, now called Pioneer, had only just begun. And with Eli beside her, with the truth of their shared history revealed, with the bio-responsive flora of the Forbidden Zone flourishing as a living testament to the power of emotional connection, that story promised to transform not just one planet, but the relationship between two species who had been separated too long by fear of difference. In the end, being born wrong had turned out to be exactly right, for Valira, for Eli, and for the future they would build together.